I heard my own daughter-in-law say I should be placed in a nursing home before I was even finished pouring the coffee. The words floated across my kitchen table as if they were nothing more than casual weather talk, something light and forgettable, but they landed in my chest like cold iron. I kept my hand steady around the ceramic mug, the one with the faded blue flowers I had owned for nearly 20 years. At 72, you learn something about silence. Sometimes silence tells you more than shouting ever could. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and I have lived in the same brick house on the north side of Chicago for almost 4 decades. The winters here have a way of testing your bones, and the lake wind does not care how old you are. But this house has always been my shelter. I raised my son Daniel here after my husband passed away 12 years ago. Every wall carries a memory. Birthday candles, scraped knees, late-night talks at the kitchen table while snow fell quietly outside the window. That morning began like many others. The sky was pale gray, the kind that promises either rain or nothing at all. I had woken up early, as older people often do, and brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the whole block. I sliced a loaf of cinnamon bread and set 3 plates on the table. Daniel and his wife Rebecca had moved into the guest bedroom 3 months earlier after saying they needed a little time to get back on their feet. I didn't ask too many questions. A mother rarely does. We simply opened the door and make room. Rebecca was the one who spoke those words. She said them softly, but not softly enough. She can't live alone forever, she told Daniel. A nursing home would be better for everyone. I watched the steam rise from my coffee and pretended I hadn't heard a thing. Years ago, when Daniel was a boy learning how to lie about finishing his homework, he would avoid looking directly at me. That morning, he avoided looking at me again. It is remarkable how quickly a room can grow quiet when truth slips out too soon. I buttered my bread. I nodded politely when Rebecca asked if the coffee was fresh. I even smiled when Daniel mentioned the weather forecast. But, inside, something old and patient began to wake up. You see, people often make a dangerous mistake when they look at an older woman sitting quietly at the table. They assume the story of her life is already finished. They assume her power faded somewhere between the gray hair and the reading glasses. Rebecca believed that too. She believed I was just a fragile widow who needed to be managed. What she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that this house, this quiet kitchen, and the woman they thought they understood were only the beginning of a story they had completely misjudged. I finished my breakfast the same way I had finished thousands of breakfasts in that kitchen, slowly and without a word. Rebecca gathered the plates with the careful politeness people use when they believe they have already made a decision about someone's life. Daniel checked his phone more than once, the way he used to when he was nervous about telling me something as a teenager. Outside the window, the Chicago morning had begun to brighten, a pale silver light reflecting off the parked cars lining our quiet street. A delivery truck rolled past, and the rumble faded down the block. It was such an ordinary morning that anyone passing by would have thought nothing unusual was happening inside my house. But small moments have a way of revealing large intentions. I rinsed my coffee mug and placed it in the sink. Rebecca thanked me for breakfast in a cheerful voice that sounded almost rehearsed. She had always been good at sounding pleasant. When Daniel first brought her home nearly 8 years ago, she arrived carrying a lemon pie and a smile that filled the room. She called me Mom before the evening was over. I remember thinking my son had chosen someone warm and thoughtful. Back then, Daniel still worked long hours at an accounting firm downtown, and Rebecca talked about opening a small design business of her own. They had plans. People always have plans when life feels steady. Over time, those plans shifted. The design business never really started, and Daniel began changing jobs more often than usual. None of that mattered to me. Families adjust. That is what we do. When they asked if they could stay here for a few months, I did not hesitate. I cleaned the guest room, washed the spare blankets, and made space in the closet. It felt natural. A mother prepares a home the same way she always has. But over the past few weeks, I began noticing quiet changes in the air around the house. Rebecca started asking small questions that sounded harmless at first. She asked about my doctor appointments. She asked whether I had considered downsizing. One afternoon, she casually mentioned how expensive property taxes in Chicago could be for someone living alone. I answered her politely every time. I even thanked her for being concerned. Yet each question felt like a tiny thread being pulled from the fabric of my life. That morning, after they finished breakfast, Daniel finally cleared his throat and leaned against the counter. He did not look at me right away. Instead, he stared at the coffee maker as if it might help him find the right words. Rebecca stood beside him with her arms folded loosely, watching my reaction more carefully than she realized. Daniel began explaining that they had been thinking about my comfort and my safety. He said a place with professional care might be easier for someone my age. He spoke slowly, choosing every word with caution. I listened quietly and nodded as though I appreciated the concern. The truth is that I had already understood everything the moment Rebecca spoke earlier. What neither of them realized was that while they were discussing my future as if I were not in the room, I was beginning to remember something important about my past. And that memory was far more powerful than they could imagine. I stood by the sink while Daniel finished speaking, the water running gently over the same white plates I had used for years. His voice carried the careful tone of someone trying to sound reasonable, the kind of tone people use when they believe the decision has already been made. Rebecca nodded beside him as if his words were simply confirming a plan they had quietly discussed many times before. I dried my hands with a towel and turned toward them with the same calm expression I had worn throughout the entire conversation. At 72 years old, you learn that reacting too quickly only gives other people the power to shape the story. Silence, on the other hand, gives you time. Daniel continued explaining that many wonderful retirement communities existed around Chicago, places with gardens, medical staff, and organized activities. He described them as if he were recommending a comfortable hotel. Rebecca added that several of her friends had relatives living in such places and that they were very happy there. She said the word happy twice, as though repeating it would make the idea feel kinder. I listened carefully, studying their faces the way I once studied Daniel when he was a boy, trying to convince me that he had not broken the living room lamp. People reveal more through their eyes than through their words. Rebecca looked confident, almost relieved that the conversation had finally begun. Daniel looked uncertain, but he kept talking anyway. When he finished, the kitchen became quiet again except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic drifting through the window from the avenue 2 blocks away. I walked slowly to the table and pulled out my chair. The morning sunlight had shifted just enough to illuminate the surface of the wood, highlighting every small scratch that years of family dinners had left behind. I placed my hands on the back of the chair and looked at my son. For a moment, I saw him the way he once was, a thin boy with messy hair who needed help tying his shoes before school. Time changes children into adults, but sometimes their decisions still carry the same nervous uncertainty. I told him that I understood his concern. I told Rebecca that I appreciated how much they cared about my comfort. Both of them seemed relieved by those words, as if they expected anger and instead received acceptance. But while they were watching my face for signs of protest, my thoughts had already traveled somewhere else entirely. I was remembering the long years after my husband passed away, the years when this house became more than just a place to live. During that time, I learned how to manage every bill, every repair, every responsibility that came with keeping a home in a city like Chicago. I learned things that even Daniel never knew. Rebecca believed she was guiding the future of this family with careful planning. What she did not understand yet was that the foundation of this house and everything connected to it had been shaped by decisions I made long before she ever walked through my front door. And that quiet truth was about to change the way both of them saw me forever. I remained standing beside the kitchen table while Daniel and Rebecca waited for me to say something more. The quiet in the room stretched for several seconds, long enough for the ticking wall clock to become suddenly noticeable. That clock had hung there since the year Daniel graduated from high school, and every small sound it made reminded me how many seasons had passed in this house. Outside, a city bus rolled down the street, and the soft vibration passed through the window glass. Chicago has a rhythm that never truly stops, even on calm mornings like this one. I pulled my chair out slowly and sat down, folding the towel neatly beside my plate. Daniel shifted his weight from one foot to the other as though he expected a difficult conversation to begin. Rebecca kept her posture straight and composed, but her eyes watched every movement I made. I could see the careful patience behind her smile. She believed this discussion would eventually end with agreement. I told them that growing older teaches a person to think carefully before making big decisions. Daniel nodded quickly, relieved to hear something that sounded cooperative. Rebecca added that they only wanted what was best for me, and that they would help arrange everything if I decided to move somewhere more comfortable. She described places with wide hallways, organized activities, and medical staff on duty at all hours. Her words were polished and confident, as though she had already studied several brochures. I listened with the same calm attention I had used all morning. When she finished, I reached for my coffee mug again, even though it was nearly empty. The ceramic felt warm in my hands, and the familiar weight reminded me of the countless mornings I had sat in that exact chair thinking about responsibilities much larger than the conversation happening now. After my husband passed away 12 years ago, many people assumed I would struggle to manage everything alone. Friends offered sympathy. Neighbors asked whether I planned to sell the house. Even Daniel, who was younger then and still learning how complicated adulthood could be, worried that I might not be able to keep up with the bills or repairs. But life has a way of teaching quiet lessons when no one else is watching. I learned how to read financial statements. I learned how to negotiate with contractors when the roof needed work after a harsh winter storm. I learned how to make decisions that protected not only this house, but the future that Daniel would one day inherit. Rebecca had arrived years later, stepping into a life that already contained more history than she realized. While she spoke about comfort and safety, I thought about the long evenings I spent studying documents at this very table, the careful choices that shaped what this home represented. Those memories formed a steady foundation beneath my calm expression. Daniel believed he was gently guiding me toward a practical solution. Rebecca believed she had already planned the next chapter of our family story. But both of them were missing an important detail, one that had been quietly waiting in the background for years. And when the time came for them to understand it, the direction of this conversation would change in a way neither of them expected. I placed the empty mug gently on the table and looked at Daniel for a moment longer than usual. When a mother watches her child grow into adulthood, she learns to recognize the difference between concern and convenience. That morning I saw both on his face. Rebecca stood beside him with quiet confidence, as if the future had already been arranged neatly inside her mind. I told them that I appreciated their thoughts and that it was kind of them to worry about my comfort. Daniel relaxed his shoulders slightly when he heard those words, the tension in his voice fading as he stepped closer to the table. Rebecca smiled in a way that suggested the conversation was moving exactly where she expected it to go. She explained again that a community designed for seniors could provide social activities, healthcare support, and a smaller space that would be easier to maintain. Her voice was calm and reasonable, the kind of voice people use when presenting something they believe cannot be refused. I listened carefully, nodding once or twice, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. The sunlight had moved further across the kitchen floor, forming a pale rectangle of light near the refrigerator. Dust drifted slowly through the beam like quiet snow. Chicago mornings often carry that gentle stillness before the city fully wakes up. I folded my hands on the table and began asking a few simple questions. I asked which community they had in mind. I asked whether they had visited it themselves. Daniel hesitated before answering, glancing briefly at Rebecca as if the details belonged more to her than to him. She mentioned a place outside the city where several apartment-style units were available. She described landscaped walkways, shared dining rooms, and weekly activities that residents could enjoy together. It sounded organized and efficient. It also sounded like a plan that had been discussed long before this morning. I let her finish without interrupting. When she stopped speaking, the quiet returned again. Daniel waited for my reaction with the careful patience of someone who believes he is doing the right thing. I could see that he hoped I would agree quickly so the subject could be settled. Instead, I leaned back slightly in my chair and studied the familiar room around me. The cabinets above the stove still carried the small scratch Daniel made when he tried to reach the cookie jar at age 10. The window frame held a faint mark where my husband once rested a ladder while repainting the trim. Every corner of this kitchen contained a piece of our family history. Finally, I looked back at them and said that before making any decisions about my future, there was something important they needed to understand about this house and everything connected to it. Rebecca tilted her head slightly, curiosity replacing some of her certainty. Daniel frowned in mild confusion. They both believed the conversation was about where I might live next. What they did not realize yet was that the real conversation had always been about something much larger than that. Rebecca waited for me to continue while Daniel pulled out the chair across from me, and sat down slowly. His expression carried the same uncertain patience he had shown all morning, the kind of patience someone uses when they believe the next sentence will finally settle everything. I rested my hands on the table and allowed the silence to stretch for a few seconds longer. People often reveal their expectations during moments like that. Rebecca leaned slightly against the counter with her arms folded, her eyes steady and attentive. She believed she was about to hear hesitation or perhaps reluctant agreement. Instead, I told them that this house had never been just a simple place to live. Daniel looked around the kitchen as though seeing it for the first time, noticing the same familiar cabinets and worn wooden table he had grown up with. I explained that when my husband passed away 12 years earlier, I made a decision that very few people knew about. Back then, the house still carried a mortgage, the roof needed repair, and the future felt uncertain in ways Daniel was too young to fully understand. Rather than selling the property or downsizing like many people suggested, I chose to learn how to manage everything myself. I spent months studying financial documents and speaking with professionals who helped me understand the long-term value of property in a city like Chicago. At first, it was overwhelming. I had never imagined that I would need to understand interest rates, property tax structures, or investment agreements. But time has a way of teaching discipline when responsibility leaves you no other choice. Over the years, I refinanced the mortgage, reinvested the equity, and gradually paid down every remaining dollar attached to this house. By the time Daniel started his second job downtown, the property was already fully paid off. Rebecca listened carefully, though her expression suggested she still believed the story would lead back to the same conclusion she had already imagined. Daniel nodded slowly, as if remembering fragments of those years when I seemed unusually busy with paperwork and appointments. I told them that owning the house outright was only the first step. After that, I began working with a financial advisor who specialized in long-term property management. Chicago real estate has a way of increasing in value when you are patient and careful. Over time, the small decisions I made began to grow into something larger than I ever expected. The quiet kitchen fell completely silent as I spoke, the kind of silence that forms when people realize a conversation is not heading where they thought it would. Rebecca straightened slightly and asked what all of this meant for the decision they were trying to discuss. I looked at both of them calmly and explained that the house they were standing in was no longer simply my home. It had become the center of a much larger arrangement that I had built slowly over the past decade. And before anyone could decide where I should live, they needed to understand exactly what that arrangement really was. I could see the moment my words began to settle into the room. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the edge of the table, while Rebecca's confident posture softened just enough to reveal genuine curiosity. For the first time that morning, neither of them seemed certain about where the conversation was going. I told them that after the house was fully paid off, my financial advisor asked me a question that stayed with me for a long time. He asked whether I wanted this home to remain simply a private residence, or whether I wanted it to become part of something larger that could support my future no matter how long I lived. At the time, I laughed at the idea. I told him that I was already in my 60s and that I was not interested in complicated investments. But he explained that stability does not come from age, it comes from preparation. Over several months, he showed me how property in a growing city like Chicago could become a foundation for long-term financial security. I began renting the small basement apartment that my husband and I had once used for visiting relatives. It started with one quiet tenant who stayed for almost 2 years. Then another. The income was not enormous, but it was steady, and every dollar went directly toward building something more stable for the future. After a few years, I expanded the arrangement legally through a small property trust that my advisor helped organize. The house remained my residence, but it also became part of a structure designed to protect its value and create reliable income. Daniel listened carefully as I spoke, his eyebrows drawing together as if he were assembling pieces of a puzzle he had never realized existed. Rebecca no longer leaned casually against the counter. She stood upright now, her arms relaxed at her sides, her expression thoughtful and much more cautious than before. I explained that the basement apartment was only the beginning. The trust gradually acquired 2 small condominium units on the west side of the city, properties that were carefully selected because they were close to public transportation and stable neighborhoods. Those units had been rented for several years now, quietly generating additional income that went directly into maintaining the trust. I never spoke much about it because it was never meant to be a topic of family discussion. It was simply something I built slowly and patiently so that I would never have to depend on anyone else for my future. The room remained silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator behind us. Daniel finally asked why I had never mentioned any of this before. I smiled gently and told him that when people see an older woman living alone, they often assume she needs protection. Sometimes it is easier to let them believe that until the right moment arrives. Rebecca glanced around the kitchen again, but this time her eyes moved differently, as if the familiar house now carried a meaning she had not noticed before. And in that quiet moment, I could see that both of them were beginning to understand that the life they thought they were managing had been carefully managed by me all along. I watched their faces carefully as the meaning of my words slowly settled into the room. Daniel leaned back in his chair and rubbed his hands together as though he needed a moment to process everything he had just heard. Rebecca remained standing, but the quiet confidence she carried earlier had shifted into something more thoughtful, almost cautious. The house around us felt the same as it always had, yet the air inside the kitchen had changed. The morning sunlight now filled the entire room, reflecting softly off the white cabinets and the polished surface of the old wooden table. I told them that the trust was designed with one simple purpose, to make sure that no matter what happened in the future, I would never become a burden to anyone. Over the years, the rental income from the basement apartment and the 2 condominium units had grown steadily. Chicago is a city that rewards patience when it comes to property. Neighborhoods evolve, transit lines expand, and values slowly rise when you choose carefully. My financial advisor helped structure everything so that the trust covered maintenance costs, property taxes, and a long-term reserve for unexpected repairs. What remained after those expenses quietly accumulated year after year. Daniel listened in silence while I explained how the system worked. Rebecca asked a few careful questions about the trust itself, the legal arrangement behind it, and whether the properties were managed by someone outside the family. I answered each question calmly. The trust had its own management company that handled tenants, maintenance calls, and financial reporting. Every quarter, I received a clear statement showing the income and the reserves. It was not a fortune, but it was more than enough to guarantee that my independence would never depend on anyone else's generosity. Daniel looked around the kitchen again, this time with a deeper sense of awareness. I could see him remembering the years when I spent long evenings reviewing paperwork at the table, the phone calls with advisors, the quiet determination that filled the house after his father passed away. Rebecca asked whether the trust included this home as well. I nodded and explained that the house had been placed inside the structure several years earlier, ensuring that its value remained protected and that its ownership would always follow the terms I established. The room fell quiet again after that. Outside, the sound of a passing train drifted faintly through the distance, a reminder that the city continued moving forward just as it always had. I folded my hands on the table and looked at both of them. For many years, people had seen me as a quiet widow living alone in a familiar Chicago neighborhood. What they never understood was that while life moved quietly around me, I had been building something steady and secure beneath the surface. And now that the truth was finally in the open, the conversation about where I should live had become something very different from what they first imagined.